In Durgapur Women's College, and you are associated with GNOSIS for some time now, and it is really a great honor to have researchers and scholars like you all. And I have also assured that they are on for a feast today on Ngugi. So thank you so much for sparing your time and allowing us the opportunity to invite you once again. Thank you so much on behalf of entire team GNOSIS. The platform is all yours now, Dr. Amitayu.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Banerjee. Well, now I would share my screen with you. I hope I am audible to everyone.
Yeah, you are absolutely audible, and your share permission is given. You can share the screen.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I can see that. So now let me declare one thing, that I'm not an expert in any field actually. I'm just a student who has been studying literature for quite a long time, and I'm not an expert on Ngugi as well. But what I feel is that I have, since I have done my PhD on his works, I have come to know about certain things which might be interesting for several people, which might appear to be interesting to several people. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity to get the chance to share my thoughts, my findings that I have got while researching on Ngugi. I have been reading Ngugi for a long time, and I have been reading Ngugi since my MA days, when I started doing my masters in English from Vishwabharati. In graduation, we didn't have Ngugi or Thiong'o, and then later on, when I was doing masters, we had a selection from a text called Decolonizing the Mind. And many of you might be very familiar with the text, because that is the most anthologized text, and that is the text which most of the universities prefer to keep that in syllabus, to have that token presence of African theorists, right? And most of the syllabus, most of the syllabi in universities have kind of inclination towards accommodating the Western, that is European and American theorists. And even when it comes to post-colonial theory, we have a very small representation from the domain of Africa. And Ngugi often finds his way into that domain through that text. But what I feel is that Ngugi should be introduced more and more, and we should not just delimit our understanding of Ngugi to within the construct of decolonizing the mind. Right? There are several other texts that he has been associated with, which is attributed to him. There are certain certain practices in theater with which we associate Ngugi, and we have to know about them as well. We should at least disseminate that kind of knowledge which we gain from those texts to our students. So I hope this lecture would be of some help, and let's see what it entails. Now, hopefully you can see my screen right now.
Yes.
Yeah, so
yeah.
Now this is the title of my topic today, Quest for Relevance. And this very title, the phrase Quest for Relevance comes from, again, decolonizing the mind. It is the last chapter of his essay, or a collection of essays that we find in Decolonizing the Mind, where he is trying to find the relevance of literature. Why should we write literature? And that actually fascinated me when I started reading Ngugi in my MA days during my masters, that probably this was the first author who talked to me with this question of relevance, that why are you reading literature? What does it entail to study literature? Why should we go into the domain of literature at all? What is the need? What kind of purpose literature would serve? These sorts of questions were hurled at me, and I found that no other author has put those questions to me before Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and that's why Ngugi fascinated me. And then gradually, as I continued to read it, I found that he has a very clear-cut political stance, which is Marxist, and most of the people would associate Ngugi's political stance with Marxism. He is a proponent and ideologue of Marxism, and he is a Marxist practitioner. He's not a theoretician only, he's a practitioner. And he's also associated with a kind of name or jargon with we associate theory that is post-colonial Marxism. And he is talking about, mostly he talks about neo-colonialism, and then the politics is quite simple, that he, especially when he talks about rejecting English as a language. And that is again a very popular discourse related to Ngugi in academia, that whenever it comes to Ngugi, you are always going to talk about language and how he says that, oh, you should not write in English. In fact, according to that discourse, I'm specifically mentioning that as a discourse because this very idea of renunciation of English is very problematic in nature. So according to that discourse, at present also, right now, we are committing a crime as we are speaking in a quote-unquote foreigner's language, right? So Ngugi would not permit that, and he would be offended. Now, let me tell you that the renunciation of English with which the discourse of renunciation of English with which we associate Ngugi often is not very simple. And as I learned during my PhD years, that Ngugi's politics is also not very simple. It's quite complex in nature. And in the sense that it has various layers within it, right? And he often deals with such ideas which are related with politics, which are related with subversion through language. Definitely, he deals with language. His primary object is language, but then he is not a person, not a writer who would merely just instruct us not to use English, but to use your own mother tongue. It's not so simple. So we'll try to understand the many layers which are there within his political stance. So the aim of my lecture is very simple. I would try to give an overview of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's works, and I would also try to explore the complexity of his political stance. So what are the layers within his political stance, and how we should, or what can be a very accepted way of reading Ngugi, a progressive way of reading Ngugi. We'll try to explore that. And this would be the structure of my lecture, or you can say a talk, or the thing that I am going to deal with today with you. So it's not an indoctrination, or it's not a thing which I am going to impose upon you, but then it's just a kind of expression that I wanted to have in front of you, exploiting this platform provided by GNOSIS. So there would be an introduction to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and then I would try to understand his politics. And in order to do that, I would trace the evolution of his literary career, that how his literary career has evolved. And I have a specific framework to do that. I divide his literary career in 3 phases, and then I would also be doing a few explorations of his works, and then I would end my lecture with a few concluding remarks. So, though we are familiar with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and we know that he has been part and parcel of what we call post-colonial studies, or post-colonial theory. Many of you might be extremely familiar with his text, Decolonizing the Mind, and you might have read a few other texts as well, like Petals of Blood is in a few university syllabus. And you will find a few other texts of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, like the trial of Dedan Kimathi. That also finds its way in certain university syllabi. So we are familiar with Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Now he's a big name. He is a canonical writer. But since it's customary to introduce the writer in every discussion in a proper way, I'm trying to do that. So he's a famous Marxist ideologue and a post-colonial writer, as well as a theorist. And he was born in a village called Kamirithu in Kenya. And Kamirithu village is very significant, especially when we will talk about his theatrical practice with Ngahika and Dinda, I Will Marry When I Want, the Kamirithu project with which he was involved. At that time, we would explore this idea of having a theater in the village and what it entails to do a homecoming, to go back to your roots. So he was born in 1938 and he was baptized as James Ngugi. So his name was James Ngugi. In fact, his initial writings that you will find, especially Weep Not Child, or his first, one of the first novels that he wrote, and then The Black Hermit, a play that he wrote during his initial years when he was a student at Leeds University, London. So at that time, you will find that his writings are having the name or having the attribution James Ngugi. And later on, that name changed. He changed his name to Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He renounced very famously or infamously his Christian name, and he took his quote-unquote African name, Gikuyu name, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Wa probably means of, and Thiong'o refers to the clan, to the family to which he belongs. So literally it means Ngugi of Thiong'o. So Thiong'o would be also the name of his father and his clan to which he belonged. And that is how he defines himself. So we find it troublesome when we try to cite Ngugi's works. Should we write Ngugi and then the page number in our research paper, or Thiong'o and then the page number? Because all the citations that we do in our research papers follow the Western discourse of authorship. And that's why Ngugi wa Thiong'o becomes a very, very problematic name. And in my thesis, I have used Thiong'o, considering it as a surname, but it is not the surname. It's not the name surname kind of a thing, which we find in several writers in today's world, thanks to the dissemination of this westernized idea of nomenclature. Anyway, so then importantly, he was imprisoned for his experimental theater. And here we have to again refer to the Kamirithu project with which he was involved. And he got imprisoned because of his engagement with that community theater, with that community learning project, which was happening in the village in Kamirithu. And we would talk about it more in a detailed manner. So this attracted me a lot when I first encountered Ngugi, that a person gets arrested because of his experimental works, because he's a writer, because he tries to do things, because he writes something which is very, very subversive in nature, which is anti-establishment in nature. So that attracted me a lot during my my master's. And presently he teaches at the University of California. He's associated with that university in the USA, as after his imprisonment in Kenya, he fled Kenya. He became an exile. He went to an exile and he settled in America. And later on, he tried to return to his mother country, but he failed to do so because he was again attacked by certain people who are known as thugs, but we don't know about the identity. So a writer who cannot go back to his country, and yet that writer gets an international fame by sitting in at the very heart of Western academia, right? So it's quite strange and it's quite contradictory in nature. And this is how we have to perhaps look at Ngugi. He's full of contradictions. He is full of various layers. And he is known for his activism. that is also a very important thing. He is known for being maverick, being subversive, being anti-establishment, and that's why his writing is not lauded by many. In fact, there has been a famous debate between Achebe and Ngugi, Chinua Achebe and Ngugi, that what should be the language of African literature. And he writes an apology for that, for his position in decolonizing the mind. So if we look at his career, that is Ngugi's literary career, we may divide that career in three phases. The first phase, which I called the phase of anxiety, begins from 1950s and ends around 1960s. In this phase, you will find that the subversive potential with which we associate Ngugi these days, or maybe in the later years in his life, that subversive potential was not visible in the way in which it would be visible in the later part of his career. So this phase is about anxiety related to independence. Now Kenya gains independence in 1963, and this is the time when Kenyans are realizing that they have got independence, and Ngugi's first novel comes around in 1964, Weep Not Child. And then there was another novel, The River Between. And both the novels which belong to this phase both the novels deal with the anxiousness of the intellectual, the middle class intellectual who has English education at his back, and he knows English very well, he can write in English very well, and yet he has certain uncomfortable relation with the language of the colonizer, with the culture of the colonizer, right? So that phase is marked by this anxiety, which you may call the anxiety of the athomi. Athomi is a Gikuyu term which refers to the people who were English educated, and yet they were nationalists in nature. They were Kenyans. They were trying to oppose the colonial processes, the colonial structure. In the second phase, we have a different kind of Ngugi, which comes around 1960s, later part of the 1960s, and stays up until 1970s, which I call the phase of polemics and politics, where his subversive potential would be more pronounced. And then we have a phase which can be termed the phase of defiance, where he overtly defies the established conventions in terms of literary conventions, in terms of literature, in terms of art, and also in terms of politics, in terms of the way in which the government would function. He would overtly go against the government. And that is the phase where we would locate in Gahika and Linda and other texts which are extremely subversive in nature. So if we go by the time frame, it might be like this, that The Black Hermit, it's a play by Ngugi which premiered in 1962. And then Weep Not Child, The River. I'm eliminating the short stories that he has written. I'm just focusing on his major works. There are a few other works which I have not included in this list. So in the phase of anxiety, you will find these works. And in the phase which I call the phase of polemics and politics, you will find Grain of Wheat. A Grain of Wheat is a very interesting work, which in a way you can argue that it straddles both the phases. It exudes certain anxieties related to independence, the newly gained independence, and it also shows certain subversive aspects which would mature in certain later works which would come in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, like the Trial of Dedan Kimathi or Petals of Blood. And then in the phase of defiance, we have these works, which are mostly written in Gikuyu. In fact, the primary text is Gikuyu. Gikuyu is a Kenyan language. It's the majority ethnic group that we find in Kenya. And Ngugi is a Gikuyu writer. What he does is he first writes in Gikuyu, and then he advocates for translation of that work. So that is how he renounces English. He's never saying that, well, you should not write in English at all. You should not write in any other language other than your mother tongue. It's not like that. So here we find I will marry when I want. The Gikuyu name is Engahika Indinda, and then Devil on the Cross. And this is a novel by Ngugi, which tries to overtly combine Christian symbolism with certain Gikuyu ethnic images and myths. And then we have Matigari, another novel by Ngugi, which was translated by Wangui Wagoro, one of his colleagues and another writer. And then we have a recent novel by Ngugi, Wizard of the Crow, which is a magic realist novel, a work which is overtly postmodern in nature. So primarily, Ngugi's career can be divided in this way. Now, if we think of the first phase, as I already noted, you will find that I call this phase the phase of anxiety. Why? Because if you read The Black Hermit, you would find that there is a character called Remy, and who comes from the urban area and of Kenya, and he rejects his village identity. So he is a classic example of James Ngugi, a kind of representation of James Ngugi, who got his education at the University of Leeds, belonging to Kamiritu, a village in Kenya, having his roots within the Gikuyu family. He goes, he learns English. He learns English, and then he goes to University of London, and then he gains English education, gains literary competence, a kind of cultural competence, a kind of cultural capital, if you go by Pierre Bourdieu's term. And then he writes about his own people. So Remy is like that. The protagonist of The Black Hermit, Remy, is like that. He is a person who would try to reject his past life, and then he would face certain consequences. There would be a kind of tussle that he would face between modernity, and he would find himself caught between modernity and tradition. Tradition represented by the villagers who would continuously call Remy the Black Hermit, who would come to their rescue because their lives have been jeopardized by the existing rulers, by the English government, by the British government who were ruling Kenya at that time. So Remy would come back to the village. That is the expectation. And Remy continuously tries to abhor that, tries to dissociate himself from his past ties. In Weep Not Child, a novel that he wrote in his earlier days, there also you will find a character who would be again caught on the cusp between tradition and modernity. In The River Between also, you have Wayaki, another protagonist of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who would try to develop his activism through colonial school culture. He would establish his own schools, and those schools would be independent schools that would be formed by emulating the colonial schools, by emulating the British, the schools established in Kenya by the colonizers, the British. And yet in those schools, there would be discussions on the ancient Gikuyu myths, the culture of the roots, the culture of the Kenyan people, and there would be certain indigenous forms which would be celebrated in those schools, which would be indoctrinated in those schools. And again, Wayaki, like Remy, would be caught on the cusp between tradition and modernity. So in Weep Not Child, you will find the violence of emergency taking its toll on Kenya. Now, let me tell you that why did emergency occur before independence? Now, Kenya got independence in 1963. Before that, there was the entire state was under emergency rule. Why? Because of the movement called Mau Mau, M-A-U, Mau Mau movement. it is popularly known as Mau Mau, but actually it was a peasant rebellion, and the name is quite a misnomer, as British did this in several places. They often misrepresented and mistakenly named certain things in certain ways. Mau Mau was like that. So the Mau Mau rebellion was actually the peasant rebellion, which was trying to oppose the colonial land settlements, which was implemented in the first part of the 20th century, where many Kenyans lost their lands because of the colonial land policies that were introduced in the 1930s. And because the colonial, what was there in the policy? Now, it's quite complex in nature, but if we try to simplify it, we would find out that the policy said that no private ownership of land is possible for the Gikuyus. Now, Gikuyus, you have to think of the Gikuyus as a dominant ethnic group in Kenya. Kenya is a country of multi-ethnicity. There are several ethnic groups who live in Kenya side by side, and Gikuyus are the most dominant ones. And in fact, Gikuyus have enjoyed certain proximity with colonial education with the British for a long time. And that is why the Gikuyus had been enjoying certain privileges when there was British rule. And if you see the post-colonial, post-colonial or the post-independence scenario in Kenya, you would find that again there was a dominance of the Gikuyu ethnic group in the colonial political in the post-colonial Kenyan political landscape. So in fact, Jomo Kenyatta, the first prime minister of Kenya, was also a Gikuyu, and he was also English educated, and he was a middle class Gikuyu, the Athomi, so to speak, like Ngugi. And now Gikuyu were enjoying this privilege. Now the problem was that because of this policy where it was declared that no Gikuyu can have a private ownership of land, the Athomis, the middle class, the rich Gikuyu, the relatively rich Gikuyus got problems regarding the land. They could not own the land. And previously, the ownership of land was also very problematic. There was no private ownership of land. The British introduced private ownership of land, yet they barred the Gikuyus from the ownership. Now, this infuriated the Athomis, the middle class. On the other hand, this policy also impoverished several Kenyans who were belonging to the peasant class, who were belonging to the lowest strata of the society, who were the actual laborers in the fields. They never owned lands. They used to, there was a feudal system at work, and they used to cultivate the land, and in that way they in a way sort of exerted their rights over land. And they used to cultivate the land. In that way, they used to exert their rights over the land. And they knew that the master who owned the land, would never ask him to leave, because the master is actually not the the owner of the land, so to speak, because there was no private ownership of land. The lands were primarily owned in a communal manner, and clan-wise it was distributed. So when the private ownership of land got introduced through the colonial policies in the 1910 and 20s, in the first few decades of the 20th century, this population who were actually cultivating the crops in the lands, they were also, their lives were also jeopardized. This infuriated them. So they joined this resurgent group called the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army. Significantly, the movement was known as Kenyan Land and Freedom Army Movement, which the British named Mau Mau Movement. So this Mau Mau movement, or the Land and Freedom Army Movement, opposed the British, and they were killing not only the British, not only the colonial officials, but also the native Gikuyus who were in league with the British system, with the colonial rule, with the colonial rulers. They were in league with them, because as on the one hand, the British were trying to make things stricter in terms of land distribution. They were impoverishing the lowest strata of the society in Kenya. On the other hand, they were also trying to make their allies, trying to create allies, trying to create their friends, whom Fanon would call the comprador bourgeoisie. And that's what they do. That's what they did in every part where they went to colonize. So that was the policy: divide, define, and rule. So you define people in terms of ethnicity, in terms of their religion, be it the Indians, be it the Kenyans, it doesn't matter. And then you divide them on the basis of their certain roles of identities, which again were defined by the British, and then you rule over them. So that's what they did in Kenya as well. And when they were ruling in Kenya, they, on the one hand, tried to oppose, try to curb the rebellion, curb the revolt which were emerging. On the other hand, they were continuously making their allies. They were appeasing certain Gikuyus, certain people who were owning certain lands, or probably they were rich, relatively rich, and they were the British rulers were giving them more and more power. So in that way, they were making a comprador bourgeoisie class. Now, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Weep Not Child, though it's a very, very early, this work appears at a very early phase in his career, it tries to highlight the nuanced, highlight the situation in colonial Kenya when there was the state of emergency. So the setting is 1950s, when the Mau Mau rebellion is already at work. It is already making its presence felt. It is actually causing a lot of violence and bloodshed in Kenya. It is killing both the Kenyans and the British. Weep Not Child, instead of going against the colonial rule, instead of critiquing the colonial rule in a full-fledged manner, in a very gross manner, it tries to highlight this situation where you find the Athomis, the English educated or the intellectual class, and then you will find the peasants who are deprived of this education, and yet they are the sufferer, the actual people who are bearing the brunt of colonialism. And on the other hand, Ngugi is also presenting people like Mr. Howlands, who would be the colonial master, the actual middle class white male heterosexual colonizer, who would be the figure of the authority, who would represent British colonialism. And in this way, he would try to engage in this very relationship that they share. So he is not in a way presenting the colonial situation in the rhetoric of, say, the haves and the have-nots, or the victor and the vanquished, or the oppressor and the oppressed. Instead, what he is doing, he is giving a very nuanced picture of this reality, which is enmeshed within the economic exploitation. So on the one hand, we can see a kind of cultural engagement, a kind of discursive engagement with the colonial politics. But the engagement is not merely cultural in nature, so to speak, right? It is definitely cultural in a broader sense. It is political, it is quite polemical in nature. Yet I would say that the subversive potential with which we associate Ngugi in the later phase of his career is not visible in this phase. Here you will see certain anxieties, certain problems which he tries to locate, which he tries to speak about. In the second phase, which is marked by a kind of polemical approach, a kind of political approach, you have a text called The River Between, and then the trial of Dedan Kimathi. So if we go by this text, So this novel, A Grain of Wheat, has three main characters. One is Mumbi, another is Gikoyo, and the third one is Karanja. There is a triangle involved within it. There are several other characters, especially Mugo is another important character, but for the sake of time, I'm not talking about all the characters over here. But then if we look at the triangle that we find over here, we would find that Mumbi is Gikoyo's adulterous wife, Karanja's coveted lover. Mumbi is a woman. And this novel is set at the time when Kenya is just about to get its independence, right? And there is a celebratory approach. There is a celebration going on. And because the political decolonization is already in the air, and people are aware that they are entering a new era, because that's how the official nationalist discourse in Kenya would project independence. In fact, all the official nationalist discourse would project independence as a watershed event, right? And there lies the dispute of the post-colonial theorists. They do not consider independence or the political decolonization as a watershed event, because independence often becomes just a mere handing over of power. From one hand to the other, the power gets handed over, and no constructive changes are there in the lives of the people who were being oppressed in the colonial rule. So they still get oppressed in the post-colonial period as well. So Mumbi represents an adulterous wife. She's an adulterous wife of Gikoyo. Gikoyo is a prosperous carpenter of the going to be independent Kenya, and Gikoyo has undergone colonial detention, and during his detention, Mumbi develops an affair with Karanja, and Karanja is a colonial home guard and headman. Remember, I was talking about the dynamics between the Kenyans, that as I was saying, that Ngugi doesn't divide the Kenyan political landscape within two parts. On the one part, there would be the oppressor, and on the other part, there would be the oppressed. But he is trying to project the entire scenario in the context of colonialism in a very nuanced manner, where you have a complex relationship among the Kenyans. And here you have a woman who would be an adulteress, who would be an adulterer who would be betraying her husband Gikoyo, and she would be involved with Karanja, the colonial home guard. So Karanja is having a very good relation with the colonial masters, the rulers, and yet Gikoyo would not have that. And Gikoyo and Mumbi, again, they mythically represent the original father and mother of the Gikuyu ethnic group. So they are the first man and first woman of the Gikuyu ethnic group. So in that way, there's a kind of mythical allegory at work. So the sexual union between Mumbi and Gikuyu entails an obvious gender framing. So because of Mumbi's betrayal, because she has an affair with Karanja, the home guard, who represents the instruments of colonization in Kenya, because of her affair with Karanja, Gikoyo and Mumbi's union, sexual union, gets withheld. And because it is withheld, we come to know that the union, which is supposed to happen for the development of the nation, this metaphorical union, which is to be done for the sake of nation building, where the ideal man of the independent Kenya and the ideal woman of independent Kenya should come together and build nation. That kind of allegorical sexual union is not visible in this text. Yet the implication is that when it would be done, a new Kenya would be born. So this entire gender framing of the nation is at work. And because there are two legendary founders, they are the two legendary founders of the Gikuyu community. One is Kikuyu from whose name we get the name Gikuyu and Mumbi. So in fact, Gikuyu visualizes Mumbi with child, and he advocates the dominant narrative of nation building, that nation is born with the union of great people, with the union of ideal citizens of the nation, citizen subjects of nation. So that nationalist allegory that Kenya is about to give birth to a new nation gets problematized in this way. Why? Because Mumbi, the mother, is culpable in nature, and Gikuyu, the father, never trusts the mother. So this is how Ngugi tries to problematize the entire narrative of nation building, which often is very popular in the nationalist, in the official discourse of nationalism. And later on, we would find that Mumbi's rise to power problematizes this dominant narrative of nation building. And we find that there is an adultery at work, the sexual union, which represents woman as the national womb, right? So this gives the birth to the nation, the new nation, Kenya, and a dominant discourse of Gikuyu ethnicity empowers Mumbi and thereby undermines this gender framing of the nation. So it is not Gikuyu who is going to lead you. It is not the man who is going to lead the nation. But we find Mumbi, who is extremely independent, because when Gikuyu is under detention, he is out of his family. He is away from his family. He is suffering from he's suffering under detention because of the colonial law. It is Mumbi who takes care of the child. It is Mumbi who gives birth to the child and also takes care of the family. So in that way, the obvious gender framing gets problematized. Here, Mumbi gets more power, at least more power over Gikuyu. And Gikuyu ethnic code under colonial rule, this also we have to understand. It talks about the capability in management of one's family, which ensures the capability in management of ethnic group as well as nation. So this is the idea of managing the nation under Gikuyu code. So if we consider the myth of Gikuyu, if you are able to manage your family, you have certain control over your family. If you can sustain your family, if you can get more profit for your family, if you can ensure more money for your family, and in that way, if you can expand your property, you can definitely have capability to run the clan. You can be the clan leader, and in the same way, by the same token, you can be the leader of the Gikuyu nation, because nation is supposed, in a mythical sense, nation is supposed to be the larger family. It is a larger clan. So that is the that is the idea in the dominant discourse of nationhood. Now this gets destabilized when you empower Mumbi, right? And this destabilizes the gender role, because this is what is expected from a person like Gikuyu, right? A person who would be the man, who would be able to control the family, who would be able to control the nation, the clan. Yet we find Mumbi is having the power to run the family. So in that way, the very code of Gikuyu ethnicity gets problematized. And this Gikuyu ethnic code is extremely pertinent to understand Gikuyu nationalism, right? And what is Gikuyu nationalism? Gikuyu nationalism is again extending this entire idea of managing your family, of managing your clan to the national paradigm. That if you can manage your family, if you can manage your clan, you can be the leader of the nation. So this very idea of being the leader is problematized. And this, now, why was this happening? Why did this idea come to Ngugi's mind to empower a woman who is an adulteress, who is having a loose character, who's morally culpable, and yet she exudes certain leadership traits within the family, and hence she becomes the icon of ideal leadership for tomorrow's Kenya, for independent Kenya. Now this can be historicized by the Affiliation Act of 1959, which again came up with the anxiety about women's marital chastity and the de facto polyandry which emerged in Kenya in the 1940s and 50s. So because of the Affiliation Act, there was a kind of affiliation given to Kenyan women to be the single mother in the 1950s and 60s. And later on, this act got revoked in the 1960s, and especially on the verge of independence, this act got revoked, that it was believed that no, it would lead women to certain immoral behavior. If they can manage to be single mothers in this newly independent country, they would be more morally culpable. Their character would be more and more dubious. So that act got revoked, and the idea of single mother was again came under threat. So there was a political anxiety regarding this affiliation act, which empowered the single mothers during this time. And the Grain of Wheat, the novel which I'm talking about, is set in this at this very time, in this very time when this affiliation act crisis is going on. And the de facto polyandry, about which Ali Mazrui talks about in his essay, that this polyandry comes from the idea that Gikuyu ethnic setup is having multiple marriages. So there would be multiple marriages for a Gikuyu man. A Gikuyu man can marry many times. Now, this idea of having multiple spouses was not only restricted to the male members of Gikuyu clan only, Gikuyu ethnic group only. As colonial rule was imposed upon Kenya and various parts of Africa, many of the male members of the Kenyan families and the African families had to leave their household. And because of that, they were never present. So women like Mumbi had to run the house. They had to do all kinds of works, right? And in this way, they got certain economic autonomy. And because of that, they were, in a way, customarily allowed to have multiple partners. And that definitely depended upon the way in which they would manage the house, manage the economy of their family. And they could have had certain partners out of their marriage. There were certain woman-woman marriages as well, if you call it a marriage. Like marriage is like staying together and having a combined family in that sense. So they were allowed to have that. They could have multiple partners in their marriages, even when the actual husband, so to speak, were away from the house. So because of this de facto polyandry, which was already there in the 1940s and 50s, women like Mumbi were already there. They were already existing. So when Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes about a character called Mumbi in A Grain of Wheat, he is in a way trying to resist the dominant discourse of womanhood, the dominant discourse of nationhood, which tries to keep women at a subordinate place, right? So in this way, Mumbi, when she resists Gikonyo's desire to impregnate her, she commits adultery with Karanja. She decides to raise the child of Karanja independently. And by resisting Gikuyu, she undermines the dominant narrative of nation building, which gives more power to man, right? So if we think of nation as a child, as a kind of a child which ideally takes birth from the womb of the mother, from the mythical mother, and who gets impregnated by the mythical father. So we have Gikuyu and Mumbi, two parents, mythical parents of the Gikuyu nation, which is Kenya. And remember, Kenya was dominated by the Gikuyus. So they would think about the newly independent Kenya in terms of Gikuyu ethnicity. They would make it an ethnic nation, especially a nation which is dominated by the Gikuyus. So that entire political allegory would be problematized in this work, in this way. So a discourse of Gikuyu ethnicity leverages this undermining, right? And the novel thus engages with the dynamics of ethnicity and nationalism, which shaped the political landscape of Kenya at the time of independence. And the novel subtly deals with the issues of post-colonial Kenya. So this is the subtlety that I'm talking about. So Ngugi is not merely just projecting Kenya as a land where there would be an oppressor and an oppressed, and there would be people who would be rich, who would be oppressing the oppressor, the oppressed people, who would be the have-nots, and there would always be the victims. So the entire post-colonial scenario in Ngugi becomes very, very nuanced, very, very problematic, and thereby we have to register, we have to note the political stance of the author, right? So now, if we think of another text by Ngugi, which comes at a later part of his career, like the text where you have representation of the Mau Mau in a more pronounced manner, right? So this is the text that came at a later part of his career, the trial of Dedan Kimathi, where he tries to exploit certain discourse of heroism which is mythical in nature. So Kimathi, or Dedan Kimathi, was a very important Mau Mau leader, Land and Freedom Army leader, who got imprisoned by the British, and he was hanged after a trial which was quite farcical in nature. And many Kenyans think that, many Kenyan intellectuals think that Kimathi was wrongly tried in a British court. And definitely it was unfair to Kimathi. Now, Kimathi gets represented as a mythic hero. He's a Christ-like figure. So Ngugi is not only using a very indigenous hero only, he is also combining the indigenous with the foreign, the so-called indigenous with the so-called foreign. So he's taking a Kenyan hero, and then he's mixing it, he's enmeshing it with the discourse of Christ, with the discourse which is very, very Christian in nature. So he's self-sacrificial in nature, and he's a face of the anti-colonial nationalist movement. Now Kimathi, on the other hand, we have to also remember that Kimathi had certain feud with another Mau Mau leader called Stanley Mathenge, right? And Stanley Mathenge was a leader who is often associated with the peasantry, with the non-English speaking Kenyan leaders, while Kimathi represents the more intellectual leader of that time. So there was a dispute between the two Mau Mau leaders as well. And in fact, the Mau Mau rebellion, to which we are continuously referring back and forth, actually was not a very monolithic movement. If you read about Mau Mau, you will understand that there are again multiple layers of this movement, that we don't know whether it was a very, very coherent movement. In fact, who was the actual leader of the movement, we do not know, because it was a kind of very, very sporadic attempt to resist the colonial onslaught. It was also a very sporadic attempt to kill people who were associated with the colonial land tenure and the colonial land policies, who were again African, who were again Kenyan in nature. So it was not distinguishing between Africans and say the British. In the same way, you will find that if we bring this to the context of India, you will find the Hul rebellion. It is often an iconic rebellion when it comes to the Adivasi revolts, and it is one of the iconic revolts which is considered to be the anti-colonial revolt. Yet, if you think, again, it was not completely against the Britishers. It was not completely against the British, the white men who were ruling over the Adivasis and the so-called Adivasis. Again, Adivasi is a very problematic term. So, or the Indians, but it was a movement which was revolting against the Daikus or the Dikus, D-I-K-U. So that means the non-Adivasi people, and the Dikus or the Dikus are again people who are taking the lands, or colonizing the economy in the hinterlands, in the Adivasi areas. right, in the Santhal areas, in the Ho areas, in the hill areas of India. So in the same way, you can say that Mau Mau was also not a clear-cut anti-colonial rebellion. It was a very, very problematic, sporadic, rather sporadic revolt or kind of resistance against the colonial onslaught. And hence we have this problem within Mau Mau. But in the trial of Dedan Kimathi, Mau Mau becomes, or a leader from Mau Mau becomes the face of anti-colonial nationalist movement. So he is, or Ngugi, what he's doing is, he's trying to create a very strong myth against colonial rule, myth against, myth to counter colonialism in Kenya. And for that, he's trying to manipulate history. He's trying to manipulate the myths which were available during that time. So if we read from the preface, we would try to understand, we would be able to understand what his intention is. So this is from Ngugi, and it's a collaborative work by Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Miseri Githai Mugo, one of the colleagues of Ngugi, a co-writer of Ngugi. They write in the preface, we agreed that the most important thing was for us to reconstruct imaginatively our history, envisioning the world of the Mau Mau and Kimathi in terms of the peasants and workers' struggle before and after constitutional independence. So this is the very important term, constitutional independence. So he's again presenting independence as Fano would represent, that independence is an arrested independence. It's a constitutional independence. It's an independence which is merely constitutional. It is not a proper independence. So to counter that constitutional independence, we need to have certain icons, and to champion Mau Mau as an icon of that struggle, to champion a Mau Mau leader as an icon of that struggle, as an index of anti-colonial resistance, was very fruitful for authors like Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The play is not a reproduction of the farcical trial at Nyeri, that is the trial of Kimathi. It is rather an imaginative recreation and interpretation of the collective will of the Kenyan peasants and workers in their refusal to break under the 60 years of colonial torture and ruthless oppression by the British ruling classes, and their continued determination to resist exploitation, oppression, and new forms of enslavement. So new forms of enslavement refers to the neo-colonialism, which Ngugi defines in various works. And here he would differentiate himself from the definition of neo-colonization or neo-colonialism that we find in Kwame Nkrumah's book, where Kwame Nkrumah defines neo-colonialism as something which is international in nature, where the so-called independent country is still under the guidance, under the rule of the colonial country. Like if in India, if everything is still governed by the rules assigned by the people who are in England, so that would be Nkrumah's notion of neo-colonization or neo-colonialism. But Ngugi's notion of neo-colonialism is different. For Ngugi, the mother country, the hitherto mother country, doesn't matter. What happens is that after independence, it was a kind of transfer of power between the comprador bourgeoisie and the colonial masters. So the white men gave power to the English educated brown men after colonialism, when colonization was officially over. So there the new colonization began, and the discourses that support it are the discourses called neo-colonial in nature, and it gives birth to neo-colonialism, the discourse that justifies this. So the challenge was to truly depict the masses symbolized by Kimathi. So they are proclaiming that they are presenting deliberately Kimathi as the symbol of the masses in the only historically correct perspective. So what is historically correct? Ngugi wa Thiong'o is trying to define that. And positively, heroically as the true makers of history. So he's trying to project Kimathi as the leader of the masses, as the leader of the workers, of the peasants who have been oppressed for a long, long time, because they are still being oppressed. This is the time when this play got premiered, 1976. So already Kenya had enjoyed more than a decade of independence. And by that time, Ngugi have realized that the independence is not a true independence. So that's why it was time to rethink about the independence, question the independence that they have got. So that's why the glorification of Kimathi as the face of the peasantry, right? So now if we move towards another play, because of the lack of time, I'm not going into details of each and every text. So if we think of Engahika Endinda, I Will Marry When I Want, you will find this play is extremely important. Why? Because it was part and parcel of the theater practice, which was part of a community educational project which was happening in Kamirithu. And the villagers in Kamirithu village in Kenya were already organizing workshops, organizing sessions where they were trying to educate themselves, trying to educate the people who were living in the villages, right? And so that they could write, they could perform. And then in the late 1970s, they hired two university wits, right? One was Ngugi wa Thiong'o and another was Ngugi wa Miri, right? And they were English educated intellectuals, and they were hired and they were allowed to join that so-called subaltern project. And they started to write with them, started to cultivate certain theater scripts or certain theatrical scripts. And in fact, those scripts were unique in the sense that the scripts were not actually written by Ngugis only, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Ngugi wa Miri only, but they were considerably modified by the villagers who were not having any knowledge of writing, who were not having any knowledge of English, right? And that's why this very idea of expanding the horizon of creativity, expanding the domain of creativity, expanding the domain of literature occurred to Ngugi's mind. That if we try to decolonize the very idea of authorship, and how can we do that? First, we have to reject English. Now, rejecting English doesn't mean that you are not going to write in English at all. But rejecting English means you are not going to make English the center of your creativity. You have to make English one of the marginal things in your creative domain. You have to make your own tongue, your mother tongue, so to speak, the center of your creation, right? And in fact, if you read Moving the Center, a book by Ngugi, this idea is clearer, and Moving the Center is a kind of sequel to Decolonizing the Mind, where he clarifies various ideas which he introduces in Decolonizing the Mind. So he actually advocates in favor of the moving the center of English writing. And this very idea came to his mind when he started to explore this entire theatrical practice in the Kamirithu village, in the village named Kamirithu. So there he was engaging with another colleague of himself, with the villagers of that particular place, and they were producing theatrical scripts which were trying to foreground the actual struggles of the people who belonged to the working class, who used to work in the factories, who used to work in the tea plantations in the surrounding areas. And if you see the Muthirigu dance songs and the general strikes and the oathing rituals which are associated with Mau Mau movement in the play, you will find that how they get the center stage. And Ngugi very ingeniously uses certain Brechtian method, and hence we find a very, very mythic montage of several things coming together. So on the one hand, he was using certain very, very Western avant-garde conventions of theater. On the other hand, he was also trying to explore the native resources, the so-called native resources, the so-called indigenous elements in the play, right? And he was overtly trying to project the struggles of the past, like the cultivation of land, as the struggle against colonial rule, which was probably not the fact. It was a myth, but that myth was deliberately created by Ngugi. And hence you have to understand this in this way, that if you read Decolonizing the Mind, he would not, Ngugi would not admit to this. He would say that I was presenting something which was actually happening, which actually happened during the colonial rule. I was trying to rediscover, I was trying to put shed light upon the hitherto unexplored domains of history. I was trying to write about the subalterns and all. But then again, he was producing a myth. It was not reality. How far it was real, how far the cultivation of land was anti-colonial in nature, we do not know. But then it was necessary. It was necessary to counter the myth which was already established by the leaders of the new Kenya, that Kenya has been independent and Kenya has been prospering, Kenya has been rising, and it has arrived at a new era which is devoid of all the oppressions which Kenyans have been facing in the colonial era. So that myth got countered by this mythic montage of Ngugi, where they say that as the peasants, as the workers have been struggling against the colonizers, the British colonizers, now they have to struggle against the native colonizers, the neo-colonial masters. This is by and large the idea in I Will Marry When I Want. So again, there is another novel by Ngugi Thiong'o, which is Matigari. Here he tries to foreground Stanley Mathenge. In Trial of Dedan Kimathi, he is projecting a Mau Mau leader, Kimathi. On the other hand, we have Matigari, which came in 1980s, in the later part of 1980s. It was again first written in Gugu and then got translated into English. Here we find Stanley Mathenge, the other Mau Mau leader. And again, Matigari, if you read it, it is a very, very loosely structured novel where the ideas of orature would come to play. The ideas of orature in the sense that this is a novel which is not for a kind of private reading. It's not a novel for which you should be sitting at your room and read it privately, but you have to read it communally. You have to read this novel to others, right? There should be communal reading. And in this way, he's trying to bring back the ideas of orature, the idea of which he calls orature, the idea of oral tradition, where a particular work of art is heard, not only read, right? So Matigari is real, at the same time he's magical. He's the signifier of the unmentionable Mau Mau, which in fact gained currency as a word that referred to the revolutionaries or the Mau Mau freedom fighters who survived the onslaught of British emergency, British imposed emergency. And it was a common myth. It was a very, very popular myth that the Mau Mau leaders who fled to the forest because of the emergency imposed by the British in the 1950s would come back to set things right in the post-colonial era, in the post-independence era, because the post-independence era is as colonial as the pre-independence era. So this is how he challenges the very historiography of Mau Mau. And this challenge is hurled at the reader through his mythopoeic imagination. And gradually, if you see another text of Ngugi, Wizard of the Crow, where he's trying to combine the ethnic Gikuyu myths with the African trickster tradition, then he's also combining certain Christian images into this, especially Devil on the Cross, another novel by Ngugi. Is famous for this combination between the Christian myths and the Gikuyu myths. So continuously he's trying to mythicize the very nature of reality. And he's not only mythicizing it for the sake of producing very, very experimental work of art, but what he's doing is that he's trying to nationalize the rebellion called Mau Mau. He's trying to proletarianize the rebellion. That is, the rebellion was actually constituted by the proletarian, by the proletariats, by the working class, by the peasants, it was not an intellectual rebellion. So in that way, he was again trying to counter the very idea of neocolonialism, the very idea of colonialism. So this is how we have to read Ngugi. And I'm repeatedly claiming this, that it's not about whether Ngugi is telling the truth, or whether he is actually recreating history on stage, or whether he is doing something which is actually happened, and it had not been brought into focus, and now he's bringing into focus. That's what he claims in Decolonizing the Mind. But that is not true, actually. He's again creating certain myths about the rebellion called Mau Mau. He's creating certain myths about Stanley Mathenge. He's creating myths about Dedan Kimathi. But his actual agenda is to counter the myths of nationalism, the dominant myths of nationhood, the dominant myths of nation statism, which again tries to exploit the working class, the peasantry. And that is how you have to trace Ngugi. That is one suitable way, according to me, to trace Ngugi's works, right? So I think I have very happily exceeded the time that I have been provided by the team GNOSIS, and these are the references. If you are interested, you can go through some of my works which are already on the internet through the journal publications with which I am involved. And these are the works that I have referred to make this presentation of today. So I think if we can end my session over here, and then we can move on towards having a few questions. If any of you have any question, you can ask those questions to me. So what do you say, Dr. Banerjee? Would this suffice?
Yeah, I think the answer to your question here is, you can see in the chat box. You will get the answers.
Okay.
Rupali Jain says a big round of applause for all the organizers and speakers for engaging us in this exchange of ideas.
Wonderful. Yes.
Thank you for the awesome lecture. Good information. Very well researched. Thank you.
Oh, yes. I'm going through.
Yeah,
that.
you
Yes.
please. You're just going, I think, the last
it is
5%.
very encouraging, actually.
Yeah. Before you started, Dr. Amitayu, this lecture, I was trying to give an idea about the concept of this GNOSIS lecture series, and I was I was trying to put across this message to my participants here, that if you see the entire series, like week 1 schedule, week 2 schedule, you will see a combination of people who the world of academia knows, and there are people who the world of academia is not aware of. I'm talking about especially the pan-India academia. So that is the honor, as Team GNOSIS, on behalf of GNOSIS, I'm getting this opportunity to expose such well-researched presentations from such dedicated scholars and researchers who are associated with GNOSIS for a long time. Right from the inception, I think there are people who are associated with GNOSIS, including you. So being in the review board, being in the review panel, I had the honor and opportunity to read the papers of scholars like you all. And with that, with that kind of reading, and with that kind of a little bit of knowledge that I have, I shared with my participants that there will be, I will not term this as dark horse, that is a very, I don't support that term. But there are scholars whom the world of academia should know, that these scholars are doing such wonderful work. And as Team GNOSIS, it's a great honor that on behalf of GNOSIS, I'm being able to put across scholars like you all, whom you would be happy. We have audience now from 5 different countries of the world, apart from the Indian subcontinent. We have audience from Nepal, from Bhutan, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from from Philippines. So it's a great opportunity that GNOSIS is having the honor. And today, while you were, while you were completely engrossed and the participants were also engrossed in your lecture, I am happy to inform you that we had more than 215 participants listening to you.
Wow.
So that, that speaks that in spite of the plethora, or you can say in spite of the flood of webinars and talks, you have this Gnosis who is, this is the 13th lecture of Gnosis, and Gnosis is going very strong with the participants number. And see that there's a name somebody is requesting. I am Partho Protim Sarkar. I am from Bangladesh. Please tell him my name because I am from his university. He's an ex-student of, I think, from your Vishwabharati, Shantiniketan.
Oh, yes, yes.
And yes, I missed Saudi Arabia. So somebody said, kindly mention that we are listening from Saudi Arabia.
Oh, so, my God.
This the kind of...
This is an amazing platform that Gnosis is providing, actually. And thanks to Gnosis and the entire team, and especially you, Dr. Banerjee, that you are taking the initiative during this time when we are undergoing a global pandemic, and then especially West Bengal, it is again facing another disaster caused by Umpun or Amphan. So this is part of our job, and we are trying to continue this pursuit of learning in this tough time. But then we need these kinds of platforms where we can really come together and explore and churn our knowledge domains, right? So I think there are a few questions which
I have jotted down the questions. I have jotted down the questions, and I will come back to the questions. I'm just giving you the background. There are audience now who are listening, I know of. They are pursuing their PhD on African literature. And this lecture will be uploaded in the due course of time in the YouTube channel with a copyright given to you. So this is a great opportunity for the researchers to read listen this kind of, lectures along with the PPTs. And I always request my young budding researchers and my colleague academicians, please don't forget, as a part of ethical research, to mention the name, to give the due credit to the speaker. Yes. So that is there. If you see the YouTube channel, there is a copyright signal also. And it is clearly written that if you somehow forget, that might attract legal, legal complexities regarding copyright. As a part of Gnosis, it is my responsibility, Dr. Amitayu, to let all my participants know and to always promote ethical research.
Sure.
Now, coming back to the questions, I have plethora of questions, but I will ask you few because of the paucity of time. The first question is a budding scholar, Miss Smruti. Her question is, and because she's just researching, she's, I think, MA previous student. So question is of that sort, and I think this question is important for the budding scholars of African and Kenyan literature. I quote her, I am not sure if such a work has been produced here, so I would like to know, is there a book that explains in details the literary history of African Kenyan literature? I'm not sure if such a work has been produced. So she wants to know if
there is history of Kenyan literature.
Kenyan literature, and on a broader perspective, African.
The problem is that detailed history of Africa. Africa is basically a huge continent, and there is a huge amount of diversity which exists in Africa. So it's very difficult to produce one single anthology on different literatures in Africa. Again, there have been certain writings on African literature, which you will find, like there's Simon Gikandi, a scholar from Africa who is very famous post-colonial writer and scholar who has published a few Cambridge University Press editions on African authors like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and you will find there are various essays by Simon Gikandi, right? So on Ngugi wa Thiong'o. In fact, he wrote a book on Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and then there is another on Chinua Achebe and other writers as well. So there is Ali Mazrui, another very important critic from Africa who writes about African literature. There are several actually. In fact, Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes about Africa in his non-fictional writings. And then again, the representation is still less when it is compared with the European anthologies on European writers. But then there are few of this sort which I know about. Offhand, this much I can let you know.
Dr. Amitayu, we also have.
You can mail it to me. I'll definitely make a reading list out of it.
That's what I was coming back to you. What are we doing is we are in fact saving these questions, and we will mail it to you, and you take your time. You write it at your own disposal, and then you send it back. We will get it published, in GNOSIS forthcoming issues. And that will be online, so that the researchers can visit the website and they visit the issue and they read these questions properly answered also.
True.
So that is also one of the.
That's a wonderful idea, actually.
Yes. That's an idea by my associate editor, Dr. Indira Nityanandam. She also deserves a lot of credit.
It's a wonderful idea by man.
Yeah. So
yes.
Yeah, I would continue Smriti's one more question. Because she is a master's student, yes. I think we need to give space to these young scholars in our academia. She asks,
sure.
Would you think it is a good idea to do a comparative study of the representation of effects of colonialism in the French literature and English literature produced by Africans? And she gives an example. For example, a work produced by a Kenyan and one by an Algerian writer.
Yeah, of course. It will be a wonderful idea. Why not? In fact, the realities of Kenya and Nigeria or any other African countries would be sometimes similar, sometimes different, and you have to talk about the nuances between them, the subtle differences which occur. So, of course, comparative analysis would be a great thing to do. That what kind of impact you have between, say, of colonialism on Ngugi's works or Achebe's works, or say, for instance, you can think of other writers like Grace Ogot, who comes from Luo background, right? So you can think of the various ethnicities which are there in Kenya, because they play a great role. Because if you only what my suggestion would be this, that you can incorporate this just as a kind of advice or suggestion, that we should not always think in terms of the countries like Nigeria, Kenya and all, because these are all countries which originated from the very infamous Berlin Conference, which happened in the 1880s, right, in Berlin, where there's this scrambling of Africa happened, that this part would be taken care of by the Germans, this part would be taken care of by the French. So again, if we follow the very structure which have been a result of the entire colonial paradigm, then again probably we have to think of decolonizing it, right? So we have to go beyond this structure which originated in the very colonial pursuit itself, right? And think of going beyond nation. In fact, if you think of Ngugi's later writings, he is very, very transnational in nature. If you think of Global Ethics, which is a very recent writing of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, you will find that he is speaking in terms of global dialectics. So that's what he names, that he's thinking dialectically like a Marxist, but then his scale is global. He's not speaking like a Kenyan, he's not speaking like a Nigerian, or he's not speaking like a Gikuyu. He is trying to go beyond those trans-ethnic, transnational boundaries, because even the idea of ethnicity, even the idea of nationalism, these are all very Western constructs. The idea of ethnicity, if you think, was very, very different before the colonial rule started in Kenya or in other parts of Africa. So again, we have to go beyond the structures, and what better way is there to except than having a comparative analysis among the authors who belong to the domain of Africa, right? So definitely comparative studies would be welcome.
Dr. Rohini from Department of English, Patna University. Her question is, why is Ngugi's role in establishing his community language? What is Ngugi's role in establishing his community language or language of Kenya, and how he did it through his writings?
Community language, well, he probably never established, or probably I'm not getting the point of establishing the community language per se, but then what he did is, we can think of the theatrical experiments that he did with the Kamithu villagers, and the language issue came because the villagers were not having the cultural competence required to produce a play in English, right? They were not having the cultural competence to produce a play in English, and that's why, since Kamithu is a Gikuyu dominated village, they preferred to write in Gikuyu. In fact, that play or various scripts that they produced during the Kamithu theatre project were translated in several languages, and they were performed in various parts of Africa and elsewhere as well. So probably this very language issue is not to be considered in a very limited way. So you have to think of this, or you should not think of this as a kind of linguistic chauvinism, that instead of English he's promoting this particular language. It's not like that. Gikuyu came because it was a kind of it provided the necessary leverage, it provided the necessary scope for the villagers to contribute, otherwise they couldn't. So that's why this language issue, that's why this change happened in the domain of language. So, and in fact, Ngugi runs a journal in Ryukyu these days, and he is always promoting translations in various languages, be it English, be it Hindi, be it any language, in fact. So that's why in establishing a particular language, I don't think we should consider in that way, if I am not wrong to understand your question.
Dr. Sijit is an assistant professor in Mahatma Gandhi Government Arts College, Puducherry. His question is, when we look at India and Africa, the decolonizing attempts in India is very superficial, like reverting the cities' names or something like that, compared to that of the African countries. Is it because we are more of a pro-colonial nature, making use of the possibilities offered by it?
Well, it's very difficult to gauge the level of decolonization which is at work, even when you change the names of places, or even when you do not change the names of places, how far you are decolonizing a particular thing, we do not know. In fact, various African leaders who emerged in the post-colonial landscape, political landscape in Africa, were very much oriented towards this English ness, this very idea of being the leader is very English in nature in Africa as well. And the very idea of say, if you think of Jomo Kenyatta in the context of Kenya, he was an anthropologist, and he studied anthropology in London. And when he came up with his text, Facing Mount Kenya, he was making a study of the Gikuyu people like an Englishman, like an outsider almost. He was pretending to be an insider, but then you will find that there are various layers in the text which often project Kenyatta as a person who would look at the African people from westernized perspective, from a perspective of the West, because he had that education in mind. In fact, Ngugi had to unlearn a lot when he started writing in Gikuyu, unlearn his English cultural competence quite a lot. and we do not know how far he succeeded. It's very difficult to commit that kind of class suicide, that kind of to renounce your cultural capital that you have gained, and then you have to look back. So it's very difficult to gauge how far Indians are Indians' way of decolonizing and African way of decolonizing is different. So how far it is different, it's very difficult to say, because both are very fuzzy in nature. And what it entails to decolonize, even if you are rejecting English, is that decolonization? Well, Chinua Achebe won't agree to that, right? But often Ngugi would say, yes, this is the first step. So how far you have to change English? Should you change English according to Indian language, according to African language, or you have to renounce English altogether and use your own language? It's very, very debatable. Which particular strategy is more effective? We do not know, perhaps. And it's again very difficult to say how far Indians' strategy to decolonize things would be ineffective, and Africans, the strategies adopted by the Kenyans are effective, right? So it's very difficult to say that. That's what be my take on this.
Yeah, Chinua Achebe reminds me, and I thought of sharing this with all the African scholars and interested participants in African literature, that Dr. Nandini Sen, Associate Professor of Bharati College, University of Delhi, she has been working a lot on African literature for the last decade, I guess. She will be delivering a lecture on Chinua Achebe on Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. So if you want to listen to Chinua Achebe at 10 o'clock morning, I will share the details with everyone. Next question. This is from Dr. Ram Sevak Thakur. He is from Nepal. His question is, Ngugi says that the slavery of language is the slavery of mind. Is it so?
Yeah, that is what he says in the context of language when it comes to decolonizing African literature. And there he represents language as a cultural bomb, which would try to affect your mind, which would try to continuously bombard your mind with the ideas that would try to inferiorize your culture and make the culture of the colonizers appear superior. So in that way, it would try to portray your culture in a very negative light. So that's why it's a kind of slavery. It's a kind of enslavement. That when you are thinking that my language is inferior to English language, and we have to speak in English because English is a better language, definitely language becomes a tool of slavery.
Rightly put, Dr. Amitayu. Muhammad Akram, he is an associate professor from Burewala, Pakistan. His question is, can we strike any resemblance between Ngugi's Kenya and Achebe's Nigeria regarding the character of Mumbi and polyandry?
Achebe's portrayal of Nigeria. Yeah, actually, this gender framing of the entire nation, or the discourse of nation, is not only restricted to Africa, but you will find this in various nationalist writings. In case of Partho Chatterjee was probably the first one to put this, if I'm not mistaken, to talk about this gender framing in terms of the nationalist writings in the 19th century and the 20th century by various Indian writers, where women would be treated as the seat of national culture, and they would be the cultural reservoirs, the cultural womb. And when already the male members of the nation realize that the so-called outside domain has been colonized by the foreign rulers, they started to protect the indoors. So if you think of Rabindranath Tagore's Ghore Baire, it's all about that, right? So the home and the world scenario is always there in that very nationalist paradigm. So it is not only, I think, applicable to Ngugi, but in various nationalist writing, you will find this gender framing, where you will find that nation as the mother nation as the mother which has a body which needs to be protected from the foreign rulers so that it doesn't get ravaged, right? These sorts of things go on. These sorts of analogies, these sorts of symbolism goes on.
Mr. Tapeshwar Prasad from St. Xavier's College, Patna. He by profession is basically a graphic designer and an author also. How the Mau Mau armed struggle for Kenya's independence against the British affected Ngugi's literary or political thoughts, but also the thoughts those closest to him.
Also the thoughts which are
closest to him.
Okay. So Mau Mau's struggle, actually what he did in the initial years, you will find that he has a problem with Mau Mau. So that's why I have divided his career in 3 phases. In the phase of anxiety, you will find that Mau Mau is a kind of threat for him. So the protagonists of, say, Weep Not Child, or the protagonist in The River Between, they are quite threatened by the Mau Mau violence, right? And there Ngugi is not taking sides at all. He's neither on the side of the colonizer, of course, obviously, nor he is actually taking the side of the Mau Mau in the initial years of his writings. He's quite confused. He's anxious about the very nature of the rebellion, the very nature of the movement. Later on, you would find that he deliberately tries to foreground Mau Mau as the ultimate point of freedom struggle, as the ultimate point of anti-colonial resistance in Kenya, right? And in that way, in so doing, he tries to mythologize, or he tries to mythicize the Mau Mau struggle and present it as a very coherent, very well developed, very well organized anti-colonial struggle, which, however, it was not in actuality, in reality. Okay, so in this way, his relation with Mau Mau changed across his career.
Miss Antralina Basu, she is a research scholar, a PhD research scholar in University of Hyderabad. First of all, she congratulates you, and I quote her, "Thank you for the insightful talk, sir. Given that the English language has become in many ways indispensable in our globalized world, would you say that HEB school of thought that English need to be renowned, that English can be transformed, deformed, reformed to become my language, is a more applicable and practical way of engaging in the process of decolonization than Ngugi's idea of renouncing English?" Same old debate.
Yeah, it's a very pertinent question. Well, actually, that's what Ngugi also does, no? Means that's why I think I call upon rethinking of Ngugi's renunciation of English, that it is not a complete renunciation of English, so to speak, though it has been popularly portrayed in the very domain of post-colonial studies as poles apart, because Ngugi and Achebe had a debate, and decolonizing the mind registers that debate, that Achebe says this and I say just the opposite of this. So that's how Ngugi projects this. But then later on, if you read other works of Ngugi, especially Moving the Center, you will find that his position is not that much extremist in nature, right? If you think of Matigari, the novel, which gets translated into English, or if you think of Ingaika and Dinda, you will find that the regular course of English gets altered. What he is trying to project is that you have to move the center of your thoughts. You have to begin, or you have to think, at least you have to think about your own people. And how could you ignore this very position? Because even if you think of English, even if you think of modifying English, in what terms you are modifying? Are you modifying English in terms of the convention set by the academia, which is quite elitist in nature, right? Which is definitely ignoring a particular group as the subaltern, and it is in that way homogenizing the entire group, right? So in that way, it is quite elitist in nature. In what terms you are actually trying to make it? And this same allegation is hurled at several kinds of art, like if you think of modernism in the European context, again, modernism was experimental in nature, but then at the same time, it was elitist in nature, which postmodern art tried to dissociate itself with. So in what terms you are modifying English, that also matters. And for that, I think you have to take into account both Achebe and Ngugi. You cannot take Ngugi and reject Achebe. In the same way, you cannot do the otherwise. You take Ngugi and reject Achebe, or reject Ngugi and take Achebe. It's not so simple. You have to make it. You have to make a very nuanced decision. You have to make a very nuanced choice that you have to modify, but in what terms you're modifying. Then you have to come back to Ngugi's Marxist politics. That are you being elitist when you are modifying English language? Because you are modifying it in accordance with the demands of the academia, in accordance with the demands of the people who are already belonging to a particular cultural domain, having a particular cultural competence. Or you are modifying English language for the sake of the people who are disenfranchised, people who are not having the knowledge of English. So what Ngugi suggests is you write in a language which is understandable by your people, and then you go for translation. What's the big deal in that? And while doing a translation, you can modify things, right? In fact, if you read Decolonizing the Mind in the later part of the book, you will find that he is actually talking about a progressive literary movement. He's not only talking about changing the language. He is actually talking about the publisher who would distribute the books. They have to also contribute. They should not think of the books which are written in English language or global language would be more acceptable, and hence I would publish those only, or we would publish those only. So that the onus of making, or onus of decolonization also lies with the publisher, because producing a book or writing is not only about the author or what the author thinks, right? It's also, a book is a material, an industrial product. So if the entire industry is not decolonized, if only the author is decolonized, and things like Achebe or things like people who think that, okay, if we modify English in certain ways, it would suffice. It won't actually suffice. It may not suffice, right? Because the publishers, the house has to be decolonized. The distributors have to be decolonized. So you have to think of decolonization in certain ways. No? So he's actually talking about the progressive movement.
And unfortunately, if you see the bulk, the majority of the publishing industry is being completely held by the Westerners.
True.
It is in their hands.
Absolutely.
And we also, I would here just like to, take the opportunity from you, Dr. Amitayu, that when one begins to read African literature, when one begins to explore African literature, one should always try to focus on how the publisher played a very, very important role in the exploration of African literature and bringing the African literature to the world. The Hannemans, I think. How Hanneman gave the opportunity to Chinua Achebe, and that is how African literature came. So if we as academicians, we also have to decolonize ourselves from those tagline of the publishers. Okay, this publisher means very good book. This publisher means very bad book. This is something we have to decolonize. And I'm very happy to inform you that tomorrow we will be having a speaker, Dr. Kumar Vivalendu Singh, who is perhaps one of the very few writers, contemporary Indian writers in English and Hindi language simultaneously, who has been the Amazon bestseller, and none of his books has been published by any very significant writer. He is an author, he is a critic, he's a film critic, and he's a tremendous singer and a poet. So tomorrow you have, and now he's doing a very good work on archiving of the Indian cinema. Mind you, he's not archiving the Hindi cinema. He is doing archiving on Indian cinema. And it is on this archiving of Indian cinema, and the difficulties that one faces is the topic of his presentation tomorrow. So the participants, if you all are interested, please do join. I have already shared the details with everyone. Now we take the last question for today. And of course, there are many questions I have jotted down. I will send to you, Dr. Amitayu.
Of course.
The last question today, I would take is from Dr. Abhishek Dev from GLA University, Mathura. First of all, he congratulates you for such a beautiful presentation and well-researched presentation. And then he asks the question, and I quote him, "May I ask about the thematic difference between Athol Fugard and Ngugi in the platform of African theatre?"
Actually, Athol Fugard and Ngugi, well, basically, what you understand as theme needs to be, I think, reconsidered, because see, Athol Fugard belonging to South Africa and then Ngugi were probably part of the larger theatre practices which were going on in the late 1970s and 80s era, when African theatre was finding its voice for the first time. Previously, it was dominated completely by the Western conventions of theatre. And afterwards, when Augusto Boal and then who came up with Theatre of the Oppressed, and then say the Brechtian techniques were very popular, they were trying to expand the domain of theatre practices, and thematic differences can be found in one play and another play of Ngugi himself. But what I find is that they are all working in the same paradigm. If you study that part of history of African theatre, you realize that that they are all part and parcel of the same kind of theatrical practice, where you will find that the actual presentation or the representation of the themes becomes very, very experimental, and theater is mostly about performance. No, we often consider theater, as a student of literature who study theater or theatrical text in classrooms, we have this problem of making it very, very two-dimensional, but it is actually a three-dimensional or maybe a multi-dimensional work of art where performance plays a huge role. So I think, be it Athol Fugard, be it Ngugi wa Thiong'o, you have to study the theatrical practices of the 1970s and 80s in terms of the thematic, the conventional, the experiments, the representational experiments which were happening at that particular juncture, where African theatre was trying to decolonize itself, especially in terms of representation, right? So that's would be my take on the comparison between Athol Fugard and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. They belong to the same group, I think, of decolonizing African theatre.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amitayu. As you can see the chat box, it has been a very engaging and very fruitful session.
And I really love the question. It was enriching for me as well. So
yes. God has been very kind, Dr. Amitayu, that we started this journey and we are doing well, and credit goes to the speakers and the participants who are making it sure that every day we sit at 5:30 and we have that mental feast every day in this world of negativity all around. So this is like an oasis. Every day in the evening we have a mental feast, and I tell you, I take this opportunity and the honor, each presenter so far, 13 of each of you all have been superb. There are no words to describe you all. So thank you so much, Dr. Amitayu. As always, you are very kind to accept my invitation, and long live this brotherhood and this academic feasting and fasting between us. And with these words, please do join us for future sessions if you are free anytime. I will share the details.
Of course.
And we equally look forward for an engaging session tomorrow and 5:30, and Saturday morning we will be having Dr. Nandini Sen for Chinua Achebe. It was a pleasure and honor on the behalf of entire team GNOSIS. Dr. Amitayu, it was absolute honor to have you. Take very good care of yourselves.
Thank you.
And dear participants, you too, maintain safe distance, take care of yourselves, and thank you very much, Dr. Amitayu. Thank you so much. This is Dr. Shweta Banerjee signing off for now. Thank you.